Hello my friends and chess lovers, this is Christian from Germany. In this video I will show you how you can force the draw in Vancura's position when the pawn of your opponent is on the 6th rank, and also I will show you how you can force the draw if the pawn is on the 7th rank. At first we start with the more easy one when the pawn is on the 7th rank. At first I'm gonna tell you something about the main rules in this position. The first one is your king has to stay on g7 or h7. Or for example, in a game your king is on this square, then you have to go for one of these 4 squares. That are the only squares you can hold the draw. Very important, mark these squares and your king has to stay on one of these 6 squares. The next rule is your rook has to be behind the white pawn, and only if the white king is reaching one of these 2 defending squares, only if he reaches one of these 2, you have to give immediately checks from behind with the rook. For example, rook to b1, rook to c1, check, check, check. And then you can hold the draw very easy. Let's give you a short example how you can manage this position very easily with black. Okay, rook gives this check. And the king is coming up to the pawn and the rook, and we only have to stay on the a file with the rook. Here, here, here. And now, after the next move, if the king reaches one of these 2 defending squares of the pawn, then you have to give forcefully the checks. For example, king here, check, 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 check. So, and for example, white's king tries to follow the black rook. I will show you now. Check, check. And here. And if the king attacks the rook, we simply go away, but we have to stay on the A rank. This is the most important thing you have to remember here. And then I'll show you the other moves. King escapes, you go back. And then you remember the king is on one of these defending squares, then you can give this checks, check. And it's the same position than before. This is a forced draw. At the next step, we're gonna look for some mistakes you can do with black. And I think this is important to show this because you can understand the positions better. At first, I can show you what can happen after leaving one of these safe squares from the king. For example, the king moves to f7, but then white has the forced winning move, rook to h8, and after rook takes pawn, he gives the check, and then white is winning. So this is not possible for black. The next square is, for example, king to g6. But this is also winning for white, because after rook check, king here, and then the pawn promotes to queen, and this is completely winning for white also. At last, we talk about the mistake when you forget to give the file checks with the rook. And now I can show you what will happen. I just play a few moves if we reach the important position. So, okay, king can reach one of the squares, for example, king to b7. And then we have the correct move, rook to b1, and this will be a forced draw. But for example, you forgot this and you play rook to a2. And this is a forced win for white now, because the rook can leave here, and if you try to give some checks, king can escape. Here, check, king here, check. And now the king can follow the rook, and there are no many checks left for black. You can see this, check, king has to follow the rook, check, king follows, check here. And now if we reach this position, you can see there are no checks left for the black rook. And this is completely winning for white. Let's have a look at the Vancura's position. This is when the pawn is on the 6th rank instead of the 7th rank. This is a little bit more difficult to understand. And the main difference between the position before is you don't give the checks from behind the pawn, instead you give the checks from the side, from the ranks. At first, let's make some rules for that. The rules for black are the king has to stay on g7 or on h7. That's the same like before. The rook has to come to the f6 square as fast as he can. fastest way is to play rook to f1 and then to f6, because here the rook is protected by the king. And then you just wait for the white king. The rook can move as much as you want, and you can move to b6 and back to f6. And then the question is, when can we give the checks with the rook from the side? The answer is you have to wait for white's king if he reached one of these squares, which can protect this pawn on the 6th rank. And if the white's king reaches one of the squares, you have to gift his checks from the side, from the 7th rank, from the 8th rank, from the 5th rank, and maybe if you want from the 4th rank too. Okay, the next rule is if the rook gives a check to your king, you should never go to the 8th rank because it's a forced lose. You should go to the 6th rank and then you keep safe, nothing will be happened. And now let's go for a perfect game and you can see how you can manage this position. Let's have a look for a perfect game with black. After king to f3, the first thing we want to do is to place our rook on f6. So we give this check, king has to move out of the way, and then we have the rook on our 6th rank. And the rook only has to repeat between f6 and b6. Maybe if your king is on h7, you can repeat the rook from g6 and b6. And we're just waiting for the white king. For example, king here, rook here, king here, rook here. And now we reach the critical position, because if the white's king can reach one of these defending squares for his own pawn, then you have to forcefully give the checks with the rook from the side. For example, king to b5, then check. Then king to b6, check, king here, check, check, check. And you can see here's no escape for the king. For example, the king tries to follow the rook, but then you can go back with rook to f6 and all is fine, all the story will repeat. For example, white tries a tricky move with rook to a2, then you should only remember not to the 8th rank with the king, instead you can go to the 6th rank and nothing will happen. For example, I play a few moves for you, king here, the rook has to stay on the 6th file, and the only thing you have to remember is when the king does reach one of the defending squares for his own pawn, you have to give this checks. For example, king to b5, check, 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 and so on, and nothing will happen. Let's look for our mistakes we can do in this position. The first mistake is if you give the checks too late. So the rule is if white's king reaches one of these protection squares of his own pawn, you have to give the checks. For example, king to b5. Then you should give the check on f5, but instead you can make the mistake and go for rook to e6 and stay on the 6th rank. But then this pawn is protected and the rook came out from a8, for example, rook to c8. And then you can see how the things are going. You cannot stop this pawn and you cannot give some checks because the king can follow the rook, and even in this position there's no check for black left and white is gonna win. Let's come to another mistake you can fall in. And this mistake is when the king is placed on e5 and when the rook is coming to f6. This position will be quite losing for black. The reason is now the rook is attacked by white's king and white now can give this check on g8. And of course black cannot take the rook because his own rook is hanging. So the king has to move to f7, but then he can give this check with the rook and both rooks are taken and the pawn is promoting to queen. The last thing I will show you is what can happen if white has an extra pawn on the extra f pawn, an extra g pawn or an extra h pawn. For example, white has an extra g-pawn, he can run and run later on, but black's king is blockading the way of the pawn and you can manage to draw with black. If white has an h-pawn, same story will be happened. If he runs and runs, king can blockade the pawn and can stay on the two safe squares. So another story is if white has an extra f pawn, because later on he can run here, for example, the rook stays here, and white now has early or later a move left, and he can play the star move, and this is pawn to a7, and now this is completely winning for white. Because black can only play waiting moves now, and if white is to move next, he plays pawn to f6, for example. And then there's no chance to defend, because the h7 is no possible square because the pawn can run. Also, king cannot take the pawn because of the trick I showed you before. Rook check, king here, and white is gonna have the queen and gonna win the game. So that's the reason why the position with the f pawn is winning for white, and that was it for today.